I'd like to thank the organizers for a very brave decision to invite me and put me on the program. What I'm talking about today will perhaps feel new, maybe even a little bit orthogonal to some of the concerns that you have. So I want to spend a little bit of time at the start setting out where I'm coming from so that we can engage a bit better. I think it's also useful to explain how the discussion about me contributing to the conference started. I understand that there's an ongoing discussion in CEOS about making the CES report more socially relevant. And the original idea was that I would have my talk in the morning, and then later on in the day would have a working session specifically on this topic. So for the reasons you know, we have changed the program. So the working session has fallen by the wayside and the talk remains. But hopefully further working on how to make the CES report socially relevant is something that we can work on further, and I can plant some seeds this morning. So let's get started. Knowledge infrastructures, so that is my object of study. So knowledge infrastructures like CEOS, that is what I do research about. And I do this coming from the field of science and technology studies. If that's not familiar, you can think about it as doing research about research. So researchers are my object of study and also my partners in the research I do. So this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about knowledge infrastructure work, explore with you this concept of socially relevant. And then given this pressure or this call or this desire to be socially relevant, I will talk a bit about how knowledge infrastructures can respond to this, suggest some questions to do it from the inside out, so rather more radically. And if we have time, with some challenges and resources in getting this started. So where is this talk coming from? As you know, science is a team sport, and I have the pleasure of talking to you today, but of course, there's a lot of people who are involved in this work. Among them, there is Martin Lonen, whom some of you will know, and Martin has many roles, but one of them is also to be part of the Knowledge Infrastructures Department 1 day a week. So that is also how this connection with you all started out. So we study knowledge infrastructures. Here is the classic definition of knowledge infrastructures. The pioneering work of Paul Edwards is cited here, and he told me he was going to join in today, so that's a big honor. So the idea here is to define a knowledge infrastructure and say, how is it different to be creating knowledge in a knowledge infrastructure rather than creating knowledge in an experiment or in a lab or in a database? What is particular about this context of the knowledge infrastructure? And since this important work, others have added to this body of knowledge. So together with some colleagues, we are looking at what it means if you are actually to include nature in a knowledge infrastructure. We have also been thinking about the different scales at which knowledge infrastructures can be meaningful. These are some references to some of that work. So to give you a bit more of a sense, let me share a couple examples. We are looking at the intersections between knowledge infrastructures that allow us to know about climate change and about renewable energy and how these two kinds of infrastructures might interact. We are also looking at the knowledge we have about migratory birds and global flyways and the knowledge infrastructures involved there. I'm also finishing up a big project on the SDGs and how those rely on knowledge infrastructures. And we've also done some work looking at soil resilience and the planetary boundaries. So I hope this helps give you a sense of what it means to look at different infrastructures and compare how they are working. These are some of our research questions. This should be appearing here. Yeah, here they are. So we are not only interested in soil resilience or in migratory birds, but also in how we are gaining knowledge about these different topics. So that's kind of the background to this talk. So let's bring it a little closer to what you are familiar with, your context. So as a complex multidisciplinary regional observing system, CEOS is a knowledge infrastructure in my view. And when I came across this diagram, I was especially interested to see it and think about it. It's very interesting because it's not linear, so it has this sense of iteration and of feedback loops. And of course, for today's topic of social relevance, the pink boxes are especially interesting. So these are the boxes that represent external consultation. So when we start talking about social relevance, this is one of the places where you would look for this to be happening. Now, socially relevant, I've put it in scare quotes here. It's one of those topics that is a little bit hard to define because it's so diverse and is so broad and also has different meanings in different contexts. But I'm sure it's something you have come across perhaps in research proposals. So these kinds of criteria are probably familiar to you, where societal impact is part of how research proposals will be evaluated. Another way in which social relevance comes up is, for example, in agenda setting. In the Netherlands a few years ago, we had this big exercise where people were invited via a website to submit questions to science. So basically you could type in, what I want to know or what I want science to answer is. And the idea was to have a very societally broad-based generation, bottom-up generation of research agendas. Of course, how you turn all these questions posed in very everyday terms into something that can be a research agenda has been a huge exercise. But agenda setting is one place where societal relevance, social relevance is increasingly present. In more mundane terms, you might also have come across it in being expected or being asked to contribute through all kinds of social media platforms. And also at the level of indicators, social relevance is increasingly present. So we are seeing a lot less emphasis on things like impact factors or even the age index. In the Netherlands, these are things that are now considered taboo. You're not allowed to put them forward as a researcher. But we see a new set of indicators for social relevance coming up. So here I have a slide of the Springer endeavor to create indicators of how research is contributing to SDGs. So a different kind of way of measuring science, not on scientific impact, on communication within the scientific community, but in terms of contributions to the SDGs. Now, I had promised to open things up, and here I'm curious if when you hear me talk about this, some of you might have examples of further demands or invitations to be socially relevant. So maybe we can use the chat to exchange about this a little bit. I'd be curious what came to mind when I showed some of these examples, if some of them resonate or if you have others that are different. Okay, so Heike, thank you. Shared Arctic variable as one instance. So here, this example, if I understand it correctly, would be very much in terms of what is being taken into account, what kind of data and knowledge is being generated. Okay, and Catherine asked whether policy or legal changes are made at national level. So indeed, societal relevance is often measured or related or considered to be achieved if our research is influencing policy. Okay, so influence on policy, popularization, dissemination, thinking about our future research plans in terms of their benefits to society, having our research evaluated in terms of societal benefits. These are all examples of how social relevance might take shape. So I think that stresses the diversity, but I think one thing that is quite common across different instances of social relevance is that it's something positive, right? So it has kind of this warm glow about it, and it's quite difficult to imagine being against social relevance, right? It's one of those things that, you know, we should all be doing, we should all be in favor of. So it's not something that you can really argue against, but of course, for all of science to be relevant to all of society is also a ridiculous proposition. So I think that signals the need to be a bit more specific about what we mean. And usually we mean that some parts of science should be relevant to some parts of society. So to better understand this, I want to share a few models of science-society relations with you to help us understand what we talk about when we talk about social relevance. So if we think about society on the left-hand side, science on the right, and their relations, I want to show a few sketches. Models is probably too big a word, but some sketches of how these relations might take place. So a first way to think about the relations between science and society I want to share is this idea of autonomy. So society provides funding and trust to science, and in return, science provides insights and discoveries. And of course, science is the area where brilliant minds are further shaped for the benefit of society. So there's a fairly distinct sense that you know, science should be left alone, it should be autonomous, and it can set its own agenda, set its own criteria of excellence and integrity. Now, to contrast to that, another way in which science and society relate might be more along the terms of accountability. So here, society might provide funding, but might also articulate in a slightly more directive way some priority areas for science. And what is expected to come out of science might be a little bit more applied, a little bit more functional, that the value or the benefits to society are not so far in the future, but are articulated already more explicitly. And then again, for the sake of contrast, a third model might be the alignment between science and society. And here, oops, went a little bit too fast there. Here we might think about when we formulate the SDGs or the grand challenges, where the funding for science become conditional, where there are also requirements for matching. So then science must not only align with governmental priorities, but also with corporate priorities. And there are real contributions that are real, more tangible or more short-term contributions from science that are expected in the shape of innovations or contributions to the knowledge economy. And yesterday we heard from the Research Council of Norway, and when Jan Bove was talking, he was mentioning the importance of knowing what is the added value of SEALs, also about the importance of user surveys, wanting to know what users, how they benefit from SEALs. So these are typical questions in this particular kind of relationship of alignment. And then one final one, this sense of emergency. that both science and society are subjected to crises, whether we're talking about climate or loss of biodiversity. And in this context, there's also a feeling that maybe science and society are not separate, but that we're in the same boat, in the same sinking boat. And through the sense of emergency, there might be very radically new configurations between how science and society relate, and also that our relation to nature also needs to be radically rethought. So this is a moment when we talk about science for the Anthropocene or science for sustainability. And within institutions, we see different ways of organizing research, different ways of organizing relationships to society in order to be able to respond to this crisis. My own working context is very much shaped by this. We are a new faculty that was established 3 years ago, and with the whole mission of addressing some of the SDGs, the grand challenges way of thinking about science. So these four models coexist. They are not mutually exclusive. And I think especially in large international projects, it can also be the case that different partners are part of contexts where one or the other model is more dominant. So I want to take the discussion of these models and really relate them to knowledge infrastructures and how they can respond to these different kinds of demands. So first of all, what is at stake for knowledge infrastructures in a context where the science to society relationships are along the lines of alignment? So as I mentioned, this is a context where the global, oops, something about my animation which doesn't quite translate well. To start from the top, this is the context where the SDGs and the grand challenges are shaping the research agenda. And what's expected of knowledge infrastructures is that they will provide data, models, and tools. And of course, this is probably not new to many of you, but the way that we gather data and the way that infrastructures are built already shape our responses to these crises. So for example, if a knowledge infrastructure is very much focused on species, that shapes how we will respond to problems of biodiversity, as opposed to a knowledge infrastructure that would be focused on landscapes or that would be focused on communities that would orient us to a different response to biodiversity loss. So one of the dominant ways that knowledge infrastructures can respond here is through outreach to stakeholders. And this is also what we saw with the CEOS science wheel, where areas of external consultation are identified in order to facilitate this, this alignment. Now, there are other elements that shape knowledge infrastructures in this particular context. We might demand of knowledge infrastructures that they become more functional in terms of sustainability. So, for example, provide new approaches to waste. We might also look for knowledge infrastructures to help us exert power and democracy in better ways. And as we are in a context with the big data revolution, where data is becoming ever more present in society, if we identify knowledge infrastructures as providers of data, then they also come more prominently into the focus. So they're considered to be much more mainstream types of tools rather than kind of purely scientific, somewhat in the background. So they are more in the limelight. So these are changes that could be quite fundamental. I mentioned this project earlier where I looked at the knowledge infrastructures for the SDGs and how they were changing because of this context of alignment. And I've shared with you on this slide some of the trends that are visible in terms of the kinds of pressures that are put on knowledge infrastructures to function differently, to provide different kinds of knowledge. So this is what happens in a context where there's this notion of alignment as the main relationship between science and society. What if we look at the emergency context? Well, in this state of emergency, there is a sense of science not only providing data, not only being the producer and provider of input for decisions, but that science needs to play a different role. In the face of wicked problems where we don't agree on what the problem is, we certainly don't agree on the decisions, and we might not even agree on who has the expertise to address those problems, then it's not clear which data should be provided or which experts should be involved. So then science becomes a location where we also need to have negotiations about, how do we define the problem? How do we define whose interests should be taken into account in defining the problem and in working towards solutions? So the question then is, can knowledge infrastructures serve as sites of negotiation when we are facing problems where we don't even agree on what the problem is? I looked for a few examples to try to inspire and feed our thinking about this. And one of the intriguing ones that I came across was the sea ice monitoring network. So it's not a project that I've looked into in great depth, but I thought it would be useful as an example this morning. And what's interesting here is that this project is not only about building a database and providing data, but from the beginning, there's a very important negotiation within the working group about what it means to be monitoring the ice, the sea ice. So not only a physical definition, but also very much a cultural, social definition of the ice that informs how the monitoring will be done. And another important element of this project is visits between communities. So this idea that the knowledge infrastructure becomes a site for negotiation is visible in this project. Now, quickly, because I see time is moving quickly, second example, local environment observers network. Here, what is interesting is that it's village-based. So again, a lot of attention to how to define the units that are being studied in the project. And here, the focus is health issues of contaminants. So it really comes at the crossroads of health, of climate change, of local geographical knowledge, of the relationships that people have with their community over time. So this is a second example where we might think of knowledge infrastructures as sites of negotiation. Okay, so you might have already had some thoughts on specific room for change. So I would also like to stop for a minute or two and welcome some additional ideas that you have. If we were to imagine CEOS as creating space for negotiation, as one of the sites where these wicked problems are being addressed, where would there be room? What might that look like? So I'm curious whether you, if I have sparked some ideas that where this room might be created within CEOS. And reopening the chat now, I see that there's some very interesting suggestions about the kinds of social, my previous questions. So thank you for contributing those as well. So is it possible to imagine CEOS as having some room for negotiation, for opening up to the wicked problems, and what might that mean? Okay, perhaps a bit of a big question to address in just a couple minutes, but as I said, one of my goals today is to sow some seeds. So my suggestion would be that if we were to pursue this, to think in this mode about the knowledge infrastructure of CEOS, it's useful to do it from the inside out. So here, if I can provocatively point to the pink boxes again, there's a sense in which there's an interface to the outside. But what if we were to really look at CEOS and the CES report from the inside and try to think about social relevance from that point rather than opening up an interface? So my idea today, or my aim today, if you're wondering where this talk is going, is to stimulate your infrastructural imagination, to see, can we think more radically or less traditionally about knowledge infrastructures? And a starting point for this are these 3 guiding questions. So as I said, this morning is just a starting point. This would take time to explore, to really develop common grounds about how these questions might make sense. So it would take months to come to a really good answer to this. But I want to spend a couple minutes just on this first question about which new relationships can be created around data. So reading in the materials of CEOS, I came across these very interesting quotations. Also in the project Svalbard, that we will hear more about these kinds of interactions. So in Svalbard, there really is an exploration of the relationship between data and those who make them. So that is one way in which it goes in this sort of more radical direction that I'm trying to signal. And later today, of course, we will hear much more about this particular project. All right, so yes, I agree, Georg, I am making you work quite hard this morning. I hope you've had a chance to have your coffee. But as I said, please see this as a first step. So if we think about relationships being, sorry, I lost my train of thought there a little bit. So if we think about which new relationships can be created around data. Now, is data about relationships? I would suggest that what we have been living through, the pandemic, is actually a way of highlighting just how important relationships are for data. So the pandemic has interrupted a lot of the relationships that we wanted to have with our data, with our field sites. And, whenever we have these online events, you keep hearing about the sense of loss that people are feeling. And this is not only effective, but also in terms of their feeling for the quality of the data that they're able to deliver or to provide, and the way that disrupting relationships also disrupts the quality, the production of data. So as an illustration of how important relationships are, I think the pandemic has taught us a lot about this. Okay, I want to just end by noting some of the challenges in doing this and sharing some resources if we are to give this a try. So it's not easy. It implies a very different way of working. And of course, knowledge infrastructures are usually built for the long term. So they are not made to be extremely flexible and flimsy, but they're solid. They have this obduracy. We want them to last in the long term because long-term observations are often considered to be very valuable. They're also distributed. Often they're connections of existing systems or existing infrastructures that then federate. So that also makes it even more difficult to change them. As I said, consistency over time is considered a core value. And we may not necessarily have the capacities for really focusing on relationships, for focusing on negotiations. I also realize that this inside-out thinking may not be altogether mainstream, but I also know that scientists are extremely creative, and that if we're able to create some space, if we're able to give ourselves permission to do things differently, then we might come up with very different ways of making data and knowledge socially relevant. I have also gathered yeah, there are also some resources. So, for example, we're seeing a lot more active and explicit demands, but also a willingness to engage. So if we look at citizen science or the movement towards indigenous knowledge, or even the whole open science movement, these are all things that can fuel this thinking differently about knowledge infrastructures. There are also all kinds of models for co-design and co-creation. So we're not at the very beginning of this movement. There are projects that we can learn from. And of course, my field of science and technology studies has quite a toolbox for this. And I have a couple of slides of further references that you might want to consult. And then finally, the funding agencies are also taking this into account. So it's not, we will also be acknowledged and rewarded and recognized for making these efforts. So if you think about all the efforts to make data fair, this already goes in this particular direction. And when it comes to evaluating research or to evaluating data production, funding agencies are also working with more complex models, looking at things like impact pathways. So the idea that impact or relevance might be very multiple and very layered. So as promised, here are some references. They will be available in the presentation. A second slide of these